And our next speakers are Kate and Danny to talk about SIG docs.
Everyone, like mentioned, my name is Kate. I'm one of the software engineers at Fermion.
And I'm Danny at Jaff Labs.
Awesome. And we're also co-chairs of the documentation SIG for the Bytecode Alliance. And so we want to take this time to update everyone on what we've been doing the past year since the SIG was formed, and areas that we want to get to in this coming year. And then also throughout the presentation, we'll break and kind of ask you all what you think needs to be filled gaps-wise with documentation, and hopefully end with even more of a birds of a feather discussion around that. Cool. So I think I actually just went through all of that, but these are the main things we're going to hit on. Given a status update on the component model book on WASI.dev. There's also been conversations about how do we expose all this information in Zulip and bring that to a broader audience. So we'll talk about that. How do we get metrics on how people do documentation? Talking about ways to send the Wasmtime's documentation and all this anticipation we have around registries tooling. What do we do documentation there? So component book. This is component-model.bytecodealliance.org, and its goal is to really introduce people to the component model in a hands-on way. And part of that is through language guides. So we started off this year with 3 language guides, and now we're up to 6. And our goal here is to keep these up to date as updates, and also to add more language guides. So if you are working on languages that are bringing in component model, please add that to the component book, and we kind of have a defined format for that. For example, Go right now updated for TinyGo support for 1.2, and we're working on that right now. So there's constantly developments there. For stars, people have been noticing us a little bit throughout the year, so just kind of giving the GitHub stars update there. And contributors, we've had a lot of people come in the past years, about 20 new contributors, and we're hoping that we can get more and more contributors, because what's great about documentation efforts in an organization is that people sometimes dip their toes into contributing there and then can move on to contribute to other projects from there. So we want to keep increasing the number of contributors in the docs. And then finally, we've updated the docs to use WAC. So for composition, WAC plug, and then also using the WAC language as well. And we want to keep using latest tooling as well, and removing older as it's deprecated. What areas that we have gaps with the component book that we're seeking help at or seeking problem solving with, WIT-MD, as you update as contributors to WIT and the syntax of WIT, if you update something there, it would be really helpful to add an issue or just directly PR into the component book. It's WIT documentation so that we can make sure that's staying up to date. One example, we're missing @since tags in the component book, and we need to add that. So little things that we aren't tracking that is helpful if you make changes to also update there. More language guides, like I mentioned, and language tooling to be up to date, and then more runtimes adding in examples. So if you're a runtime developer and want the component book to have examples with your runtime, that would be a great area. JCO we have in process as another runtime to run our examples in. Right now, it's just Wasmtime. So those are definitely some gaps. I also want to pause here and ask anyone else if you have used the component book recently and there were things you were expecting to be in there that weren't, because this is a great time for that information. And online, I don't have access to Teams on my screen, so if anyone sees anything there. And if anything comes up, any ideas come up, feel free to throw it in chat at any point. We'll also have time at the end of this presentation to keep getting more feedback. WASI.dev. So WASI.dev hosts all of interfaces. It explains what WASI is. And it was kind of the same original version of WASI.dev for almost 2 years, I want to say. I don't know the exact timeline, but over this past year, Gregory completely revamped it. It now uses Docusaurus, which means we can add contributions really easily. And it also makes it a better entry point for people looking to understand what WASI is. So it lists all the interfaces, as I mentioned. It points to the component docs if people want to start implementing components. And it also points people to how to get involved. So it mentions all the different subgroups and how you get involved. And it mentions earlier phase proposals. One of its goals is you can land on wasi.dev and see, oh, something is in phase 1 or phase 0, and I'm interested, like web GPU, for example. I want to get involved there. I can see that interface from wasi.dev and immediately get involved there. Previously, you kind of had to go to WebAssembly's GitHub org and look for prefix WASI, which works, but this is helpful there. So the call to action here is if you start an interface and it's in an early phase, PR it in. Let's point to other people to it. We'll also periodically do that search of WebAssembly org, WASI hyphen, and pull you in as well. But that's a great place to bring that in. And we aim to explain the phase process on wasi.dev as well. Great. And I'll pause here. Are there any things that people think they expect wasi.dev to have that it does not? Once again, this can be a thought that you can mew over as well.
In chat, we have working examples for the interface. UI, HTTP.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right now, WASI is very information-based and doesn't have a lot of things to execute or build or examples. So that's definitely something to consider of, here's this interface, what's a component that implements it, and pointing to that from wasi.dev. We can definitely think about that and whether that's the best place for that or the component book.
Yeah, I think there might be some examples of like the CLI stuff in the component book. Yeah.
But I think having something that maps an interface to a component that implements it would be interesting. And even kind of an explainer would be very. Gaps. Okay, one thing we haven't thought about with wasi.dev is what is wasi.dev's responsibility for patch versions. So 0.2.2, 0.2.3, what should wasi.dev do there? And should it be involved in any way? So right now we just have WASI P1 and WASI P2 and the interfaces that are there, and we link out to where those interfaces are hosted. But with registries and also with now more regular release cadences of WASI, how should we share that? And so that's something that we're trying to think about and explore. And if people have thoughts on that, would welcome to join that discussion as well. This is going back to kind of the sneak peek that I mentioned about this, but there's a really cool issue that someone brought up on component docs that basically said, we have all these questions that are asked in Zulip, asked over and over again, and they're also answered in Zulip by the people who understand this ecosystem very well. And how can we bring those questions and answers and make them searchable by like Google and all other search engines and ingestible by LLMs? And they pointed out that Zulip has the ability to capture archives, and then you can point to them from indexable sites. And so this is something that we want to take on, is regularly archiving Zulip, making it searchable, maybe attaching it to bytecodealliance.org in some way where that information is being disseminated more easily and discoverable more easily. Furthermore, we'd like to take a more hands-on approach of triaging Zulip. So periodically going into Zulip and finding what those common questions are and seeing if that's documented. And if it's not, putting up an issue to document it, documenting ourselves, something along those lines. And this in particular could be helpful for the Wasmtime book, finding out where there's gaps there, and just documentation in general. And so we'll probably do some of this triaging in SIGDocs meetings if you're interested in that process. We might also do it a little bit in Wasmtime meetings and see how that goes as well. And to talk a little bit about Wasmtime book extensions, one thing that Nick mentioned that they've gotten a lot of questions about in Zulip is, how do I do X with Wasmtime? So how do I build like a functions as a service platform with Wasmtime? How do I put Wasmtime, run Wasmtime on a system without an operating system? How do I configure faster compilation with Wasmtime? How do I build a plugin architecture? So these common questions are popping up in Zulip. And so it'd be great if we could extend the Wasmtime book to have a common architecture section that would define what those architectures could look like with Wasmtime. So this is something that we'd be interested in looking at. And we actually might have a breakout session later today to maybe build one of these examples, because once you have one example, it's a lot easier to build other ones. But just defining the architecture, not necessarily building it out and walking someone through building it, but blueprinting what it should look like. And we also want to fill gaps with the Wasmtime book by seeing what the gaps are. So compare it to other runtimes. Do they have certain documentation that we don't, but we do have that support, and kind of fill in that gap. And then, like I mentioned, the Zulip triage, we'll be trying that for the first time in the next Wasmtime meeting. And now I'll pass it over to Danny.
Yep. So another thing that we would like to do is better use metrics for how people are interacting with our docs. We've had some cool conversations with David today about the fact that bytecodealliance.org is already using plausible analytics. So this information is being captured. It's not on things like WASI.dev and the component book, but we've heard there's just a header that we can add, and then we get to from the same metrics that bytecodealliance.org does. So definitely that is something that we would like to do in the near term, as well as look at those metrics and make decisions based on what we see. And then registries. I don't know who online was there earlier, but we already had a bit of a conversation about some of the updates that have been going on in the packaging SIG. WAC currently does not yet use WASI package tools, which Taylor showed off quite a bit earlier today. So as WAC uses WASI package tools, as well as hopefully a variety of guest-laying tool chains, this is definitely something that we think should be documented in the component book. And then this, again, also would have an example where you could have something that depends on a specific interface, and then you would use WAC to specify which implementation you would like to satisfy that interface dependency. And then I also talked quite a bit about unlocked depths and having a kind of semver resolution for implementations of components that exist inside of a registry. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do in documenting any of that, because there's not a lot to yeah. And then what else we'd like to do is create a project board for BA docs for people. So this is kind of some of the stuff that we were mentioning could happen in a birds of a feather session later out today, as well as better SEO, which could also be something if we are indexing our Zulip stuff. And again, yeah, birds of a feather, I think this is some of the stuff that will come up later in that session. And then, yes, joining SIG docs. There's a bunch of information here about how you guys can get involved. We meet every other Wednesday at 11 Eastern time. There's a link right here to the SIG meetings, as well as all the other SIG meetings. We have a Zoom link here, as well as a Zulip channel where people can ask any questions about things that they would like to contribute to docs, or yeah, things that they've noticed are missing in docs. Yeah. Lines.
Yeah, so I think at this point, we really wanted to open this up to kind of see where people feel like documentation is missing. And from the perspective of whether you're a runtime developer, whether you're giving a talk about WebAssembly at conferences and what people are asking, where do I get started? And you want to know, is there gaps there? Just general areas where people feel like documentation is missing for the WASI and components ecosystem, or if any of those questions we brought up prompted any thoughts, we'd love to hear about those as well. Yes.
An area of documentation I've heard is missing is documentation for the component model binary format. Not all developers need that, but a lot of people who are working at the low levels are doing their own embeddings, are very interested to know, like, how does this thing actually work? Just an area that I've heard a lot of feedback from.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you feel like there's a specific tooling or project within the Bytecode Alliance where that documentation would best live and what should live in a specific book targeting those kind of developers.
That's probably a specific book in that case, I guess.
That makes sense. And my immediate thought is that is maybe intimidatingly low level for people who are consuming the component book. And so that'd be a good opportunity to maybe start thinking about a new book as well.
I'm also curious about some of the stuff in the component model, like spec repo, and like there's the WIT-MD there and like the explainer. And I think there's a binary MD there as well.
There is, it's documented, but it's not in a format that's accessible to everyone.
Yeah, so maybe like maybe that would be like a good way to start is by like going there and looking at like what is opaque to people in there and trying to see if we can get like items out of that, if that's something that people want.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the repo that we have our documentation in, github.com, Bytecode Alliance /component docs, that is structured so that we can add multiple books to it. So the component book is just one subdirectory of it. So that would be interesting to add an extra book to that. So even if it is just a more human readable format of what is there in Markdown.
Is it like it's component model binary stuff? Or like curious if these are people who find the like core WASM spec approachable and it's like specifically.
For core WASM at this point, there are quite a lot of sites out there that will like walk you through like byte by byte, how does hello world work kind of site. So you can find it out there a lot. For component model, that just doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, those are like mostly kind of like in the form of like personal blogs, maybe. Or I'm curious how much of it is personal blogs versus like organized efforts.
I think it's mostly personal blogs, but you can find it.
Yeah.
This exists somewhere, but I don't think it's in the book. Just general WIT documentation. I struggled a lot in the past without to like learn it.
Yeah, so there's wit.md, but we took that and in the component book tried to make that more consumable. So that should be in component docs.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be in there, but I would love to hear what you think about it.
Actually, on the book, one time.
Okay, yeah, just click the WIT tab and we can give you 30 seconds and just let us know.
Yeah,
Must be short.
Some it would just be. Syntax doesn't like get updated that much, but I know like recently she gave an example of something that got updated in like the WIT-MD and not in the book. And when she was saying that, I was like, I bet you that's also true for nested packages.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. If there was some way to like remember whenever WIT syntax gets updated, that probably means that a component model book, the update should also happen. That would be nice.
We could probably work in some CI for that. So
yeah,
that's fair. I think we can end a little early unless there's comments online. Perfect. Like I mentioned, we'll have a breakout session later today on just starting a discussion and maybe even an example, written example of common architectures for Wasmtime. And our meetings, like we said, are bi-weekly. So if anything comes up, you have questions about any of the areas we talked about, making new books, for example, or any of the areas we touched on you're interested in working on and contributing to, we need more help. So that would be great. Yeah. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you.